Why are the Jewish people the most persecuted, hated, murdered, destroyed, devastated, and yet still here people in the history of the world? First of all, my answer to this is going to come from a religious perspective. I was raised as a Messianic Jew. That means being ethnically Jewish, I was raised to believe that the entire New Testament is the true part of God's word and Jesus is the Messiah. So this answer is going to come from that perspective. Now, the story of the Bible is fascinating, but I'm going to sum it up because it contains the very answer to the question posed. Mankind in the beginning was created by God to be in relationship with God. They were given a test. They failed the test. They fell into sin and rebellion. They fell into generations of darkness. But God had a plan, and his plan was to bring mankind back to him. But by this time, hundreds of years into darkness, they had fallen into such barbaric evil that first God had to reteach mankind the difference between right and wrong. So he picked somebody who looked like a good subject to start with, somebody who would be faithful and follow him, and that person was Abraham. And he used this one man to build up a family that he would teach his ways again, and then use that family to teach his ways to the rest of the world, and through that family, bring all of mankind back into relationship with him. That is why the family of Abraham, which went through many different names, Israelites, Hebrews, Israel and Judea, but for the last few hundred years have simply been called Jews, have also been referred to as the chosen people, not because they were chosen to be superior or to rule, but simply because they were chosen to be the messengers to bring mankind back to God. And they did that. They wrote the entire Old and New Testament, the Old Testament being what regular Jews today consider their Bible, and the New Testament being what Christians consider also part of their Bible. Now, according to the Bible, the final act of God bringing mankind back to himself was to come in the form of a human and take the punishment for all of our evil upon himself so we could be reconciled to him through his son, and his son came through the very people that he was using to teach his ways. Those people would then take on this final challenge and lead all of humankind back to him. But just like in the garden, thousands of years earlier, the Jewish people failed, and the majority of them rejected the Messiah that came through them, and they didn't see Jesus as the promised one. And so therefore, while a small portion of Jews did accept him and began to lead the rest of the world to him and began to lead non-Jews back into finding relationship with God through what later was called Christianity, the majority of the Jews rejected this Messiah. And at that point, God had to fulfill what he promised in Deuteronomy, that if you turn away from me and turn to false idols, and in this case, the false idol was their own religion, their own belief in themselves rather than seeking God and humbly receiving his Messiah. So they turned away again, and just like earlier in the Old Testament where they were banished from their land for several hundred years and then brought back, once again, as it says in Deuteronomy, they would be banished from their land for many hundreds of years, and they would be persecuted. They would be made a spectacle to the nations. They would be made to endure things that people had never heard of, such horrible things. And that's exactly what happened for roughly 1,800 years. Now, why would God do this to a people he refers to as the apple of his eye? That was a term that people used back then to mean the most precious part of your own self. If they were his children, why would he treat them so horribly? Well, you have to understand the entire Old Testament is about God teaching this people his ways. And as they rebel, they get punished over and over again. They get decimated over and over again. They get refined as the evildoers die off, and only the people who with the truest hearts remain to continue this flame and to continue to grow closer and closer to this plan that God has for them to learn his ways. So it's 2,000 years of God hammering his ways into this one people group. So by the time the Messiah came, this people group was one of the most powerful, one of the most intelligent, one of the most creative. They had the principles of God hammered into them so deeply that they were basically capable of ruling the world or dominating anyone and everything, not because they were inherently better than anybody else, but because they had these skills that God had put into them. How, all throughout the Proverbs and the Bible, all of the skills teaching you how to be a better person, how to live a better life, how to be more successful in life. They had those skills pounded into them for 2,000 years. So without the humility and the love and the purpose that God had for these people with these skills, they could have easily become arrogant and boastful. And just like earlier, when a whole group of people tried to build a tower to heaven thinking that they would be greater than God, they had to be humbled, because if they weren't humbled, they would think that they were the source of all this great power that God had put inside of them. So you see this strange mixture for the next 2,000 years after Jesus ascends to heaven. It's only a few years right after that that the Romans come in and destroy all of Judea and kick most of the Jews out and scatter them across the whole world. And you get to see what happens with this people of God when God is punishing them, and yet they still are who they are. They are this magnificent people, not because they themselves are better than anybody else, but because God has put his discipline in them for so many years. So as they're scattered throughout the whole world, the world treats them horribly, as is God's intention. This is his will, for them to be disciplined and refined and humbled. So they're treated awful, but they still rise to the top in every society. They still succeed. They still, every place they're put, they become the masters of their trades, even when they're excluded from certain areas. And the whole hilarious thing that anti-Semites say about Jews using banking and underhanded usury to try to undermine society, they were forced to be bankers. At certain times, there's superstitions that certain Catholic areas believed that to be a banker or to charge interest was evil. And so let's just make these evil Jews do it, because we need to have banks and we need to be able to borrow and we need to be able to have loans in order to build society. But we don't want to be the ones to do it. So make the Jews do it. And so they were forced into these positions many times. But then they would get so good at the banking system, they would be so diligent at it that they would become wealthy. And then, of course, they were looked at suspiciously, and it was twisted and turned on them. Oh, well, they're evil because they're getting so rich off of our money and they're putting us all in debt. Ironically, the whole idea of not using interest, or usury as it's called, comes from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. It doesn't come from the New Testament. And in it, God doesn't say don't ever use interest or don't ever give loans. He says do not make the loans so overwhelming that you put people into a position of debt that they can never come out of. But in any case, this pretty much explains the rest of history, that for almost 2,000 years, the Jewish people were tortured and persecuted all over the world. And then the final greatest persecution happened with the Holocaust. And it was in the 20th century where something miraculous happened. And this is what you read the entire chapter of Romans 11, and you will see, if you are a Christian, if you are a Bible believer, if you believe in any of this stuff, you absolutely need to read Romans 11. This is where basically Paul explains what happens, which is that because the Jews rejected their purpose in bringing humanity back to God, because they rejected their Messiah, it was instead given, the purpose was given to the Christians, to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, to serve this purpose. And they were given the mantle to serve this purpose for the next 2,000 years. And that's where you have Christianity blossoming. And Christianity created the West, which is the most successful civilization, the first civilization to create and build human rights and to build upon peace and to build empires, not based on conquering, but based on democracy. Obviously, it wasn't perfect the whole time. There was brutality and there was evil and there was a lot of non-Christian influence everywhere. But overall, compared to every other civilization on Earth, the West has brought humanity so far out of darkness into a better life that we don't even understand how blessed we have it compared to how the most of society lived in history. The brutality, the lack of human rights, the abject poverty, the having to work 18 hours a day down to your bones just to barely have enough scraps to survive the next day. Compare that to the opulence and the just overwhelming wealth we have today. That's ridiculous, as well as how well we're instructed to treat each other. Back then, everybody treated everybody horribly. It was just might makes right. Whoever could be the biggest bully just rose to the top. And we've come so far from there that we look back on that time and we think, oh, they were so barbaric. But we're not better. We just got lucky enough to be born at this later time. But back to the Jews, Paul says in Romans 11 that the Jewish people are like a cultivated grapevine, and some branches were broken off. Those are the unbelieving Jews, and they perished. And some wild branches have been grafted in. Those are the Gentiles. They are now in the family of God with the Jewish people as their root, Judeo-Christianity. But he says specifically, Paul says, do not become arrogant and think that you're better than these non-believing Jews. Yes, they were broken off because of their unbelief. And yes, you are in, but you stand by faith. Don't become arrogant. You can be broken off just as quickly. And if you were grafted in and are now in the family of God, how much easier will it be to graft them back in when they decide to believe again? And if their rejection of the truth means salvation for the Gentiles, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? And so all Israel will be saved. And there he's predicting the end times. In the end times, all Jews will come to Jesus and they will all be saved, and they will finally fulfill their purpose of leading the rest of the world into relationship with God. The torch was passed temporarily to Gentiles because the Jews failed temporarily, and they went into 2,000 years of punishment for that. But don't you, as a claiming to be a Christian, don't you fall into the trap of thinking that they're evil and you should punish them, the non-believing Jews. Don't you fall into the trap of believing all the lies that anti-Semitism has created. Those lies and all of that persecution was ordained by God. It had to happen. But God says evil has to come, but woe to he through whom it comes. Don't be one of those people. Instead, Paul says, they may be your enemies in the faith, but because of the patriarchs, they are beloved on your account. You are to honor them just as if you would honor your father or mother. Let's say your father or mother fell into alcoholism. You would understand that they were going down a wrong path, but you wouldn't reject them and hate them and say that they were evil and curse them. You would honor them still if you were a good son or daughter. And that's how humble, true Christians are to see themselves, as the children of the faith founded by the Jews, almost like they are a type of parent. Now, the funniest thing happened is in the early 20th century, two things happened simultaneously. Jewish people began to return back to faith in Jesus in a very large revival. There are many different names for it. One of the biggest ones is called the Messianic Jewish Revival, Messianic meaning Messiah. And at the same time, Jewish people began to recultivate the land of Israel and to move back in, and were given their land back, declared by the whole world, first by the League of Nations after World War I, and then by the UN after World War II. They were officially granted the title to govern the land that they had returned to peacefully, and by buying up land and by cultivating land that nobody wanted at the time. And I talk about that in my other video. You can watch it, how there were no Arabs massively kicked out of their homes. There were no Palestinians who were kicked out or tortured or pushed out or had land stolen from them. That was a complete lie. The story is radically different, and it's actually an amazing story. It's a wonderful story. But that all happened in the 20th century. And so are we in the end times? I don't know. I am not that deep of a biblical scholar that I'm going to make a decision on that. All I know is you, as a Christian, this message is to you. Honor the non-believing Jewish people, as it says, as God says in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. It takes a deeper level of humility to say, I'm a Christian, I believe the truth, but I'm going to honor these people who don't believe the truth. And I'm going to honor them even in their unbelief, even as they are a tiny portion of society, that they're this strange people that got kicked around and they have these strange ways. And what is it about them? Honor them, and God will bless you, and God will fill your heart with love, because you don't get anywhere with hate. And there is a huge surging movement in conservatism, and it's been there in leftism too, but both sides now are growing in this weird anti-Semitism that we as Jewish people never thought would come to America, because America was the land of the free and the home of the brave, and it was one of those countries that had mostly treated the Jewish people very well compared to all the other nations. And that's why America was blessed, partly, among other things, also, mostly because America was founded on Christian principles by devout Christian people, in my opinion. But in any case, hold a special place in your heart for the non-believing Jews. Honor them, love them, be patient with them. Don't try to force them to believe before they're ready. Trust God. Let God use you as a witness in kindness and in patience, and watch your life be filled with more blessings because of it. Thank you for watching. Please give me your comments down below.